If you are starting a vertical farm and don't know where to begin or which technology would suit your needs, then reach out to the experts at Cultivated. As indoor farm brokers, they help connect you to the right technology and ensure your project is successful. Best of all, their service is free because they work on behalf of their partners. Visit cultivated.com to learn more. And that's spelled cultivatd.com, or click the link in the show notes.
Before I actually started teaching, I really wanted to do this like kind of micro thing and like kind of travel around and actually learn from farmers, ranchers, and see what they're actually doing on a farm. But I didn't get a chance to do that. And so about the time that I started the podcast, I was like, well, you know what? Why don't I learn from like the experts? Like, why don't I see what a rancher in Texas is doing versus a rancher in Florida?
Welcome to the Vertical Farming Podcast, weekly conversations with fascinating CEOs, founders, and agtech visionaries. Join us every week as we dive deep into the world of vertical farming with your host, Harry Duran.
Vertical Farming Podcast Season 7 regular listeners, welcome back. I'm grateful that you take the time to check out the show each and every week, and I've been really heartened by some of the recent ratings and reviews, which I'll read out in a couple of minutes, and the feedback that I get on the social channels as well. It's really helpful. It's definitely a bit of work to put this together with my team, and I'm looking forward to see some folks in person at Indoor AgCon, which I'm getting ready for in a couple of days. If this is your first time listening, I'm sure you're in the right place, as this is the show where we interview fascinating CEOs and founders of the leading vertical farming companies from around the world. I'm your host, Harry Duran. In case you missed last week's episode, we had a great conversation with Caleb Wilkins, who I connected with at AgriMe in Dubai. He is the co-founder of Renaissance Ag, which is doing innovative work creating consistent, reliable, and on-farm premium feed for livestock producers. And we had a nice conversation about the challenges of food independence and security with Caleb. High energy on that one. If you haven't checked that out, episode 85. This week, we do something a little different. I have a conversation with Trevor Williams. He's the podcast host of Farm Traveler. As you might imagine, when two podcasters who are in ag tech space get together, we cover topics ranging from vertical farming and regenerative agriculture to topics like cellular agriculture and food production for space exploration. On his show, Trevor interviews farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs from around the world, and they provide his audience with valuable insights and education about the industry. I think you'll love the energy on this. Again, something a little different than a CEO interview, but when Trevor reached out, I felt there was a great opportunity to talk a little bit about podcasting and what we're discovering from our conversations with these fascinating folks in the space. Really excited to read out a few interviews that have come in, one that I may have read out before, but I thought I'd read it again because of the author. It says, I have over the past 2 weeks binged every single episode. This is something I've been considering for some time, but found it hard to find info. Thank you for all the great information and contacts. Keep up the great work. And that's signed Trevor, so I'm thinking that might be Trevor himself who wrote this review, which is fun timing, and why I decided to read it out again for this episode if I read it already. This is definitely a new one from the real Krugen. He says it's got all the goods, and he generously rated it 5 stars. I found this podcast after I had taken a job as the hydroponic research lab manager at a high school. Our school recently purchased a container farm to serve as a learning laboratory for students, and even though I have about a decade of traditional agricultural research, I didn't know much about the vertical farming space. Harry has been an excellent companion to having learning all there is to know about this industry. I've already used a lot of the information I gained from listening into my upcoming research class on CEA. The conversations are informative and thought-provoking, which is extremely beneficial for a lifelong learner tackling a new subject. I would highly recommend this podcast to anyone wanting to learn about vertical farming and the aspects of the industry. Just when you think you have a grasp of what is happening in the industry, boom! A new guest blows you away with what is happening now and what the future holds. Great podcast, and I look forward to each episode and pass them along to my students. Thanks for all the hard work you and your team are doing. It shows in each and every show. Matt, South Carolina Governor's School for Science and Mathematics. Well, I know that was a lot, but I really, really appreciate Matt taking the time to write that extensive review. It really warms up my heart, and I say that as I'm recording this in the middle of a snowstorm in Minnesota, so it's literally warming me up. Thanks again, Matt. I really appreciate that. If you would like your review read out on the air, which is always fun for me to do, leave a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/VFP. Nothing gets me more excited than to read those out on the air. Before we jump into this uninterrupted conversation with Trevor, here are a few words from the folks that support this show. This episode is brought to you by Indoor AgCon 2023. I'm so happy to have been working with the team last year. Indoor AgCon 2022 was my very first indoor farming conference. So it was really eye-opening for me. So I'll always be grateful to the team there for rolling out the carpet for me. And really had a good time meeting a lot of past guests and excited to join them again this year. Entering its 10th year in a row, it's the largest trade show and conference for vertical farming in CEA, and it's returning to Caesars Forum Conference Center in Las Vegas on February 27th and 28th of 2023. Once again, they'll be co-located with the National Growers Association show as well, which is a really good fit for them. The conference keeps growing, and this year it's doubled in size. The expo floor now has more than 170 booths filled with new product resources and solutions to explore. You'll hear from experts, including CEOs, growers, investors, and others in the field during this full-scale educational conference. As always, you'll be able to connect with peers, grocers, and other potential new business partners at their great networking events. I haven't even gotten to the best part. The team at Indoor AgCon has given listeners of this show 20% off their full access conference pass. All you have to do is use promo code VFP, as in Vertical Farming Podcast, and sign up at indoor.ag. See you there. This year, Vertifarm takes place from September 26th through September 28th at the Exhibition Center in Dortmund, Germany. For those new to Vertifarm, it's the most significant trade fair for next-level farming and new food systems. Their international platform is set to showcase the latest developments in innovative controlled production systems for vegetables, salad crops, herbs, and microgreens, as well as sustainable fish, insect breeding, fruit cultivation, and medicinal plants. Vertifarm is shaping the future of vertical farming and new food systems. Reserve your ticket and learn more at vertifarm.de. That's vertifarm.de. Trevor Williams, host of the Farm Traveler podcast. Thank you for joining me on the Vertical Farming podcast.
Harry, thanks for having me, man. Excited to chat with you. I always love chatting with a fellow podcaster.
Yeah, so this is a met on several fronts because I started my podcasting journey in 2014 with my first show, Podcast Junkies, where I interview other podcasters, and then Vertical Farming Podcast in 2020. So now I'm coming back full circle because I'm now interviewing another podcaster about vertical farming on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Super meta, a podcast about a podcast on a podcast.
Yeah. Well, what I love and what was interesting for me with that first show was I didn't really plan it that way, but when you're interviewing other podcasters, they generally tend to have good gear and good sound, so that's helpful.
Yeah, that's the best part. I mean, they've got good microphones, headphones. They know like the best practices. Like I need to mute notifications on my computer, have a good microphone, have a good web camera. So yeah, I mean, it takes a little bit of that pressure off a little bit.
Yeah, I'm always excited to have these types of conversations. I know the main focus of this show has been my journey in learning about vertical farming, everything CEA, and it's been fascinating. And I've been now, as we were just chatting in the green room, so to speak, about some of the in-person conferences that I'm excited about that I've been to. I went to Indoor AgCon, Indoor AgTech NYC, and got to Agrami in Dubai, courtesy of my current sponsor, Cultivated, who flew me out there in October. So that was a great experience. So it's just so interesting now to learn more, and the industry is so exciting. So I love having the opportunity to do something a little bit different than we normally do on this show and get your take on really, I want to hear about your experience and how, you got into farming. So, as far back as you want to rewind the clock, maybe start with where you grew up and where's home now.
Oh man, that's like one of the psychologist questions. Like it all started when I was born. Yeah, so I'm from Florida, lived in Florida my whole life, grew up in a little town called Bluntstown, we literally have 2 stoplights. But my first foray into agriculture farming, my grandpa, who lived right behind our house growing up, he had a catfish farm. And so like every couple of weekends, they would seine the ponds, get the catfish, and they also raised like hybrid bass. And so that was kind of like my first foray into agriculture. And then I was super active in Future Farmers of America in high school, state officer here in Florida, and then I got an ag education degree from the University of Florida. I taught for 2 years, had some fun. I taught in Daytona Beach, Florida, and actually the high school was like 2 miles from the Daytona 500, which was always kind of cool. It would be a little bit hectic about twice a year, but did that. Decided on a career change, started doing software development, and then I kind of missed being an active part in agriculture. And my wife was like, hey, you should start a blog. And so I started the Farm Traveler blog in like 2017. And then that was about the time podcasts started booming. So I was like, hey, let me start a podcast. So started it And I think 2018 or 2019, I think it was 2019. And I've interviewed farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs all throughout farming, agriculture. I just love learning more about ag and kind of showcasing people that, it's a lot more than cows, sows, and plows. Like there's so much technology, there's so many disciplines involved in it that when you show people, they're like, holy cow, like I didn't know that this industry is so evolved. And that's something I love learning about CEA. I mean, vertical farming has been booming the past couple of years, and you show people all the technology that's happening, that's developing right now, it like blows their mind. They're like, hold up, there are all these like rooftop gardens in New York, Chicago, Dubai that are, saving countless transportation miles or carbon emissions from transporting all the goods. So I think it's cool. And I can't wait to see kind of where it goes in the next 5 or 10 years. I think it's going to be absolutely wild.
Yeah, it's really interesting as far as the journey for me, because the regular listeners will know that it started with a book called Abundance by Peter Diamandis that a client had given me, which talked about, technology in the future. And then Dixon Despommier's book was mentioned, which obviously I ordered right away, got through in like a day because it was such a short book. So, but I was like, whoa. And he's still on my to-do list. We did have a short email exchange. We have mutual acquaintances through some of the guests I've had on the show. So my goal for this year is to get him on because he's I feel like he's sort of like the godfather of vertical farming. So that was interesting. Just a quick side note, based on where you grew up, you said you grew up in Daytona. So you've made it to you actually gone to see a Daytona 500 event?
I never did, unfortunately. So I grew up in Bluntstown. I moved down to Daytona to teach. So I was there like 2 or 3 years, but I unfortunately never went. My apartment was honestly like a mile away from the racetrack. And what was weird, I could barely hear it. I mean, I thought I would hear
Really?
the racetrack and everybody.
Yeah.
The traffic was terrible, but I never actually heard the races and everything, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, like 50 weeks out of the year, totally normal. But those 2 weeks where you had the 500, like another race later on in the year, I think it was wild. Like you couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah, from what I've heard, the sound inside that stadium, wherever it's held, is like deafening. It's supposed to be like one of those once in a lifetime experiences. You think about just watching cars go around the track, but I think it's the whole thing being there, I think is something to see.
Yeah,
the other thing that I remember from college is that Daytona was a popular spring break destination as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny. So I live in Panama City now, and it used to be like the college spring break capital, and now it's kind of the family spring break and summer capital.
Funny. Yeah.
But Daytona was like the main hot spot like 5 or 10 years ago. So yeah, I mean, the Florida beaches, everybody loves the Florida beaches in the spring. I mean, for real.
So you talked about your original interest, in farming because you experienced with your grandfather and how you got started, and then left and came back. And so what was it about what was happening in the world of farming that intrigued you to start the show? Because if you don't have any familiarity with podcasting or blogging, it's a lot of blogging's a little bit easier. Obviously, you can just start writing, but podcasting, depending on when you started. Nowadays, there's a lot of tutorials online. So what made you go down that path to start having these conversations with folks?
Yeah, so before I actually started teaching, I really wanted to do this like kind of micro thing and like kind of travel around and actually learn from farmers, ranchers, and see what they're actually doing on a farm. But I didn't get a chance to do that. And so about the time that I started the podcast, I was like, well, you know what? Why don't I learn from like the experts? Like, why don't I see what a rancher in Texas is doing versus a rancher in Florida or Montana or somewhere? And so I really just wanted to pick everybody's brains and see what they're doing, what works for them, what doesn't. Because I mean, there's like when it comes to consumers, they have a lot of thoughts about what actually goes on the farm. And that's really what I wanted to gear the podcast towards, educating consumers on what goes on in agriculture. But what I learned is that a lot of farmers wanted to listen to the podcast because they wanted to see what other farmers are doing. They wanted to share tips and tricks. They wanted to see what works in other operations. And so I really wanted to learn. And then I kind of had this like mindset change like throughout the podcast where I'm not trying to show everybody what I know about agriculture. Instead, I want to be a guide and just kind of learn alongside them and just kind of figure out, let's ask the questions to the experts and see what's real and see what's not. And so it's been really eye-opening. I mean, I've learned a lot about vertical farming, a lot about organic farming, why a lot of producers actually do both organic and conventional, which is something that I was very unaware of. And just kind of like, especially, I mean, the pandemic was huge because a lot of farmers pivoted to stay in business. And the ones that pivoted doing direct to consumer models were really successful. And they've kept that up since the start of the pandemic years ago. And so it's been I thought I would kind of learn most of it in the first year or so, like not a whole lot would change, but no two episodes are the same. No two farms are doing the same practices. So it's been a plethora of learning, which has been super fun, which I'm sure you've experienced as well, because
Yeah.
you've covered a lot of episodes as well.
Yeah. And so when you think about your audience, have you, over the years of doing this show, to put together like a vision in your mind of like who you're speaking to, or maybe based on the feedback you've gotten either through your socials, newsletter, or, direct feedback about the content of the episodes?
Okay, so this will get meta from podcaster to podcaster, but they always say like come up with an avatar for your listener. And I think it's about 40% consumers, 60% farmers and ranchers.
Okay.
Like that's kind of like a vague breakdown. I'm not sure about like the how many are male, female. I mean, I have that data for like Facebook and Instagram and stuff. For the podcast audience, I'd say about 40% consumers, 60% farmers. And the consumers are wanting to find farmers that they can buy from, that they can buy direct, whether it's within their state or they can order online. And farmers are wanting to learn like, oh, maybe they want to do direct beef sales, but they don't know how to do it. Maybe they are a conventional grower, but they want to, venture into organic and they want to figure out why to do that. What are the hoops and balances or the hoops they have to jump through and all that good stuff. So I would say that's kind of like the breakdown of the listeners. When I started the show, I was really a lot more vague. Like I was just like, oh, just people that want to learn about their food. But now I've kind of tried to focus it a little bit more on farmers that want to or consumers and farmers that want to connect through direct to consumer products or even agritourism. Like they can go on a farm and tour it and see what's going on. But yeah, I'd say that's kind of like the ideal listener that we have. It's always changing, but at least for right now in 2022 and 2023, that's who the listener is, I think.
The agritourism is interesting because I'm seeing that now on the vertical farming side, either through virtual tours, which I got to experience. IGS, Intelligent Growth Solutions, had a booth. It was in Indoor AgTech NYC. I was chatting with Callum, who's on the team there, and he had me put on the VR. And so we went into their indoor space, and it was a bit unnerving because, you get that, you're thrown off, like, balance wise, because you've got the VR set and you get on the platform and it sort of like lifts you into like a small, like internal elevator. But it's interesting because you can see, like, you look around, it's 360. So you get the experience of the LED lights. And so, it's as close as you can get without having to actually be in the site. And it's still one of the things, 2 years in, that I have on my list to go see some of these farms in person. I'm going to have to do like a road show or something like that. I do get a taste for some of it now that I'm going to the conferences. I was at Agri in Dubai, and they've got, some of the setup so you can get a feel. And that's a pretty big conference, so you get a feel for what's happening there. So have you had, an experience where you've been able to actually like connect with some of your previous guests, or, actually been to the farms as well?
Yeah, so far we've done, I think, about 3 or 4 like farm tours, and I post them up on YouTube. And so far, they've all been people that we've had on the show. Luckily, it was Lava Aloha, which is a chocolate farm in Hawaii. Legacy Greens, which is, a really good one that you might like to have on. They have a microgreens farm in Tallahassee, Florida. And so theirs was really cool. Went there, toured them, kind of saw how they did it. Another one was Sindel Farms in Marianna, Florida, and they're a dairy farm. So went there, toured them. We toured the dairy farm as well as their ice cream creamery that they have. So they produce their own milk, they turn it into ice cream, and it's, I'm a little bit biased, but their ice cream is phenomenal. They have like 20, 25 flavors, and it was so, so good. But yeah, that's always super fun. But I've seen a lot of people online that have like video tours that you can just go to their website and they have like a video poster where you can just kind of follow along very quickly. Even some VR tours, which I think are always like really, really cool. I wanted to talk about this because I think VR is super cool, but there was a study, I think like a year ago or something, where I think it was in Russia or somewhere. They gave their dairy cows VR glasses, and the happiness levels like rose 20% in the cows or something like that. I don't know how they track that, but it was like the VR environment that the cows were in was like an open field or something, which was really cool. And so I thought that, VR is not only transforming humans, like how we do business or how we tour stuff, but it can also transform livestock. Like I think that's going to be really wild. So I thought that was cool. You mentioned VR. I wanted to bring that. I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, well, yeah, we can go down one of those rabbit holes as well, but it's interesting. So many questions, because I'm like, you have to like create custom goggles for the cow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I guess if there's so many different ways to think about that, both sides of the coin, because you're like, it's sad that you have to fake them into thinking that they're actually living a happy life on a pasture. But, like happy cows, less stressful meat. None of those hormones make it in there. My partner and I have gone, for the most part, pescatarian, but we've recently introduced meat from Hawaii, of all places. You mentioned Hawaii. And there's a company called Maui Nui based on Maui. And there's an overpopulation of deer. I forgot what kind of deer it is, but they've overrun like a part of the island. So now what they've done is they've set up so they sell the venison from there. And what happens is these deer, they live like a full life. And then they have marksmen, like snipers, basically on the premises. And so one shot down. So there's no being fed through a lot and the stress and the hormones and all that sort of, because, they've demonstrated that those fear hormones make their way into the animal. And so it's really interesting. They dress the deer on site, like on the grounds, and then they flash freeze them. And then you can order a box of it. It's not the cheapest, but it's an interesting way to get back into eating meat. And I'll tell you, I mean, it's normally when I've tried venison in the past, it's a bit gamey, but now this is almost like you really don't have to cook it. It's like medium rare, at most medium, and it's absolutely delicious. So it's really kind of opened my eyes to the possibilities and stuff like that. It's called Maui Nui, and they've got a whole plan for how they're culling the population. And they send you these newsletters every month about what's happening on the farm and what's happening, really keep you updated. So it's one of those, when you have the connection to the food you're eating, I think it's pretty fascinating. So that's pretty interesting for me.
Yeah, that's something that I love, connecting, whether it's, just normal produce, fruit, or animal proteins, connecting to it is so cool. You can figure out hey, I know the farmer that raised this cow. I can ask him, phone call, Instagram or whatever, just send him a message hey, how do you raise your animals? Can I view and see how you do it? I mean, it's so cool. You're taking that anonymity out of it, where you're not having to guess. You're not, well, I hope this was raised, sustainably, regeneratively, whatever else there is. You can figure that out and you can support it, which I think is awesome. You can support great venison from Hawaii. I think that's awesome. I mean, I wish that more and more people would do that. I think that's phenomenal.
And then last comment on the VR for the listener, and we'll move on to farming stuff. We recently just caved in, and my partner had first gotten the Oculus VR, the Oculus 2. She had it for a bit, and she's like, "Oh, you should get one." And I kind of poo-pooed it, and I was like, "No, I don't want to get lost in that world. I've got enough connection with technology." But it's interesting. The fitness apps have been game-changing. So there's one called FitXR. There's one called Supernatural, where you're outdoors. And what happens is you've got the goggles on and you've got the handsets, and they're boxing games. And so I just did a workout this morning. I kid you not, if you do 10 minutes of boxing and uppercuts, everything, they walk you through it, and they can detect your motion through the motion sensors of the handles or whatever they're called, controllers. I'm telling you, Trevor, I'm sweating, and the next day I'm sore, in my pecs. And then they have stuff coming at you, so you have to squat or move. And if you do then this is the beginner ones. They have intermediate and advanced.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
I've done a 15 or 18 minute one. I'm sweating by the time I'm done, and I'm sore the next day. Just because if you think about it, it's the movements. And if you go all out, it really has changed my perspective on it. And it's just interesting how you could just do games where you're just sitting on your couch and just kind of mindlessly going through. So there's a great Tetris game, by the way. Just if you're old school like me and you love Tetris, there's a new version that's immersive, that's amazing, with amazing music. So
that's cool. I bet that's trippy, but I bet that's really fun though.
It is, because you've got the immersive sound, and it's the first time you put them on and you look around and you're in a room and it's 360, it's really jarring. So it's just one of those things that always want to be well versed about technology that's happening. I'm going down a chat GPT rabbit hole now, because I'm just whoa, AI is so there's so many things that are happening, and I feel if you don't keep up with it, in 5 to 10 years, it's just technology that's happening. It's going to be in the way we normally do things. We'd mentioned VRs now in farms and stuff like that. So it's really interesting to see what's happening. And we'll get back now to the subject of farming.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's crazy. I have a buddy that introduced me to some AI stuff. I wrote in a template, oh, hey, tell me about some meat alternatives. And it wrote this very detailed paragraph. And I was oh my gosh, this is much better than anything I could ever write. It's crazy to think about what it's going to be in a couple of years. I mean, it's already really good.
It's already pretty nuts. Yeah.
Yeah. A little dangerous, but good.
From a podcasting perspective, and also from a writing perspective, I've joined this cohort called Ship 30 for 30. It's run by a couple of guys who focus on digital writing. So writing for the internet, writing for Twitter, and writing for, blogs and stuff. So it's been a great experience the challenge is to write what they call an atomic essay, 250 words, every day for 30 days.
Oh, okay.
I'm in day 11 today. So it's been interesting. Like on top of everything else I've got on my plate, just churning out one of these a day and posting it across all my socials. So that's been a great experience to kind of work that writing muscle, which I think is something that's been helpful for me. I write a blog post, a newsletter once a week, every Saturday. And so I think for this year, in terms of goals, just kind of getting better, because I've always been podcasting, because I was like, hey, I'm better at talking than just writing. And now what I've come to realize is like, now that I'm familiar with podcasting, long form interviews, I've had over 310 on my first show, closing in on 80 with this show. And so it's really it's just a different skill set, to learn. And just, I like this idea of just always learning, just being the eternal student, I think has been fascinating and part of like the reason why I started this show as well.
Oh yeah, I always think about it like, the different learning modalities like auditory, visual, kinesthetic.
Yes.
Like podcasting is great for any auditory learner, but if you have somebody that wants to learn via reading, like have a newsletter or something, like I think it's a great way to address all of those different learning modalities. Yeah, I mean, I do blog posts every now and then, and every time I write them, I'm like, man, I wish I would have paid more attention in English class. Like I wish I would have paid better attention on how to write better cohesive stories, essays, and all that good stuff. But I mean, there's so many things out there, like you're saying, like that 30 for 30 challenge and YouTube videos and countless other things and courses and stuff that you can take. But yeah, it's always good practice. I mean, I feel like we can always learn how to tell better stories, whether that's podcasting or writing or whatever that is.
Yeah, and it's one of those skills that I've just come around to realizing how important it is, for your whole life. Like the basis of being able to communicate effectively with people, even if for anyone who's listening, just being able to, whether you're in a 9 to 5 or you're an entrepreneur, or just communicate ideas to your boss about like why you should be getting a raise, or like why you deserve the promotion, or communicating to an audience that you're trying to sell to or market to, or communicating to your spouse, like all these things. It's interesting. And what I've seen is it serves as the basis for everything else I want to do. So I've been testing out reading out the blog post on YouTube, just to the camera, just read it out, and then I just do a quick edit. So it's now, I just focus on creating that one piece of content every Saturday, and then I can generate tweets from there, a LinkedIn post, a Medium post, a Twitter thread, a YouTube. I mean, if I wanted to do short videos like the IG Reels, I'll just read out the tweet, or I just read out the bullet points. It's been fascinating. And if you think about the stuff that's shared on Instagram, a lot of time it's quotes. It's a visual platform where people are sharing writing. So it's really been interesting for me to kind of like look at that aspect as well.
Hey, I mean, all content is good content wherever it is. I mean, you're just putting that stuff on the internet. Everybody can find you. I mean, especially for a podcast, like it's weird marketing a podcast because you want to market it everywhere, but everybody's listening on podcasts. So you've got to have your marketing on podcasts and guest on other podcasts, be on other podcasts and all that good stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I always remind folks on my show, on the other show, and even for the clients we work with through the agency, like the best place to find a podcast listener is on another podcast.
Yeah.
So there's people who are listening to this right now and be like, oh, Farm Traveler, I've never heard it. And so I'll recommend that you pause right now, whatever app you're using to listen to this interview with Trevor and myself, and look up Farm Traveler on your favorite podcast app. And then hopefully you'll get some new listeners as a result of that.
Hey, perfect. That's a good segue too. I like that. I'm going to have to use that one day in like the middle of an interview, like, hey, pause right now, go check this out, go check out this guest, and then come back.
What I love about this format and what I love about this specific episode is it's the beauty of podcasting. For me, it's conversational. I've always enjoyed it from the time I first started. I had my list of questions in the beginning when I first started, like every podcaster does. And then you quickly realize, like, if they're just, closed-ended questions, like, what's your favorite book? Or, what's your spirit animal? I don't know, like, you ask those, and then like, once you get through them, you're like, if you don't have any way to continue the conversation, you get a lot of dead air. And I just realized very quickly, it should always feel like the listener is there with us, and they've pulled up a bar stool and we're just having a conversation and just sitting there listening. I always remind people there's 3 people in a podcast conversation. There's the host, there's the guest, and then there's the listener. And I always refer to it as listener singular, who's listening with Trevor and myself now, because there's one person listening to your show at a time. I think when podcasters first get started, they think they're on stage and they're like, hey, everyone. Yeah. And it's not. It's just a really intimate medium. So if you had to think about, looking back at you when you started the show and your objectives for why you started the podcast, and think about now, present day, if you think about what's a couple of things that come to mind, if you have to think about or identify some of the best things that have happened because of you starting the show?
I would say, I mean, kind of going off of what you were talking about where, podcasts it's a good conversation. I think just some of the relationships that I've built because of podcasting, whether it's with different podcasters or guests that I've had on the show, I think that's been super fun. Like just kind of making those connections. I mean, I've gotten a lot of like free stuff from farmers like, hey, try our chickens. I got one of my past guests, he has an organic farm in California and he sent us 2 organic chickens to try, like whole chickens. And I was
Oh,
like, this
wow.
is so nice. Like you did not have to do this. Thank you so much. But I mean, just building those relationships where those people like trust me to try something and to give like an honest opinion for it, I think is awesome. And I mean, even Jason Meadows has another podcast out there in the ag world. It's called Ag State of Mind. And his is all about kind of like the mental focus or dealing with the mental stress of being a farmer or rancher and like different tools and stuff. And just, I'm not a farmer or rancher, but just listening to that, listening to those stories has been awesome, and connecting with him and just kind of talking. I've had him on the show. He's been on my show. And so honestly, I would say those relationships have been like really phenomenal. And I would say like kind of more so than, I mean, as a podcaster, like download numbers are everything, but I really value those relationships and just kind of having those conversations with people. And I think that's really fun. I try to tell that on the show, like, hey, this show is all about like building relationships. Like, I hope this show connects you with the farmer that you can relate with, that you can identify with, that you can, talk to, that you can support. And so I think at the end of the day, that's really all that matters, just relationships with everybody. And I think that's been one of the really cool things that kind of has developed because of this show.
Yeah, I will wholeheartedly agree. I've been really happy to see how that experience is translated to the real world. The first conference last year was Indoor AgCon in Las Vegas in February. And I was a bit anxious because I was like, I've just been having these virtual conversations. I'm very comfortable in the podcasting world, but in the indoor farming world, I was like, I got to see some of my guests, my previous guests in person. Caroline, we were talking about her, and it was just interesting to see how many folks just are relatable. And it was just fun to shake someone's hand and just like engage with people. And so that sort of broke the ice. And it's interesting this always happens with podcasting because they're like, oh, Harry, I love your show. Like,
Yeah.
I've been listening. And it's like, or they recognize, someone mentioned that they recognize my voice, which it gets a bit weird sometimes when you're there. And I got to hang out with the folks from NetLed as well. And I was in the booth. I was talking to Nico, the CEO. He had been on the show before. And someone who was on this team was standing next to me. And she's like, she turned over and she's like, when you heard me talking, she's like, Harry, the podcast. She's like, oh my God, because she heard me talking, and it was really interesting. So just for having follow-up conversations, then I had a great time in Indoor Ag Tech NYC, so many people there. And then the great thing about it is I see all these new companies. And so I'm like, I had a lot of follow-up conversations already on the show from people that I've met there. And then, always eternally grateful to all the sponsors that have been on the show or that have supported the show: IGS, Series Greenhouse Solutions, Freight Farms, Cultivated. I think it's important as a podcaster, to always recognize that like they're really like the lifeblood. Like you said, the farm that sent you those chickens, it's just like always an opportunity because we have this platform to just, really share the word about the people that we're coming into contact with and that we're having great experiences with. I think that's helpful because it gives the listener sort of like educates them on what else is out there, who's doing good stuff, and who should I be paying attention to.
Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, and I love that, how focused podcast can be and build like a huge audience. I mean, like your show, vertical farming, like that's a huge industry that obviously a ton of people want to learn about. And I mean, it's so great that because podcasts, you can really focus on that niche, you can really dive at it and you can build a lot of relationships, have a huge audience, because a lot of people share that same interest, that mutual interest of vertical farming, like what the industry is now, what it can be in 5 or 10 years, different technology that different companies are offering. Yeah, I think it's huge. I think podcasts are awesome. We're a little bit biased here, but I think they're great.
So when did CEA, indoor farming, come on your radar? When did you start becoming aware of what was happening in the space?
So in college, I had several plant science classes, and I took one where I really learned about hydroponics, and I thought it was like super cool. I was like, wait, you can grow plants in water? Like, this is really cool. And so I did a couple of experiments with that. And then when I eventually started teaching, we had a greenhouse, and it was like a small little greenhouse, but we had an ebb and flow hydroponic system that we raised with tilapia. And that was super cool. I was like, this is really neat. I love this sort of stuff. Let me look into it more. And so I started to learn more about, the different vertical farming systems that are out there. I bought this really cool goldfish tank that had like a little, you could grow like mint, cilantro and stuff, like different herbs on top. And that was really cool. And then just to learn about all the different like consumer systems that are being made. and then slowly learning about different companies like Gotham Greens, Arrow Farms that, were growing huge amounts of plants inside in huge urban areas. And so just learning more about that, I thought it was really cool. So when I started teaching, it was right before kind of the LED shockwave where, it used to be these really big bright bulbs that were super expensive, and that's what we had at the school. And then when I started getting some home kits, LEDs were everywhere. And so that kind of transformed it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, is everything changing with the CEA world? And then I started producing another podcast about a year and a half ago, but it didn't really get off the ground after like 3 episodes. But it was focused on all the different CEA companies out there, specifically for ones targeted towards space. And I thought that was super cool. Like all the different environments that are being created, like different habitats for the moon, the Mars, even the International Space Station, and then growing food in space, which I think is super cool.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, CEA is just, growing food indoors, but it's so much more than that. I mean, every company is doing it their own unique way. I thought about this when I was trying to think of some good talking points to bring up today. Because, a good podcaster is always a good podcast guest on a podcast.
Yeah.
Companies like Arrow Farms working with people like Bell Labs to develop drones that can fly around the indoor growing areas to monitor stuff. Like, I think that's so cool. Like, you think that, we always hear that technology is going to replace jobs, but now we have more jobs, like jobs to develop those drones, jobs to work the drones in the CEA environment. Like, I think that's so cool. And so there's so much going on. And I think really it's just kind of scratching the surface.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's interesting because we talked about AI earlier, and a lot of people are, when the first wave hits, creators are really like, feeling that. I think, there's another tool called Midjourney where you can create images, and people are going crazy with that. And so a lot of creators and designers just like, well, so it's almost like, where do you find your place in this new world? Because it's not going to slow down. It's just going to get faster. Like writers now, you're writing, or a proofreader, even Google is shaking in their boots with what OpenAI is doing with ChatGPT, because to be honest, people are searching for stuff now in ChatGPT as opposed to Google. I literally have a tab open now in ChatGPT, and if I had a question about something, I'll ask it there in the meantime. And then, then you mentioned the drones and the cameras and the sensors to see, I think what I heard recently was cameras to detect how quickly the plants are ripening, specific strains of like bugs and pests and diseases that you can detect visually or through a heat signature. So, I mean, and because the drones are getting smaller, they can operate in these small indoor farms. I saw something about like using drones to help bees pollinate, or like having the pollination done. It's so weird. I mean, it's getting some of it a bit Black Mirror-ish, but, but I don't think it's almost like a finger in the dike to think that there's not going to be some way in which, AI is going to be touching, obviously, farming. You've seen it with like the satellite controlled farming gear, GPS controlled, and all that sort of stuff. And it's so interesting to see and putting that to use. And I think it is for the benefit of what we're trying to solve. Like, all the conversations I'm having, and I'm sure you're having, about like these challenges we're having about feeding the world and access to local food and supply chain issues and food deserts. And there's so many challenges that need to be addressed related to the future of food. And I keep saying it's an all hands on deck moment.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like the AI that's being developed for like self-driving tractors, or there's a bunch of companies, which I think we've interviewed on the show, I can't remember, but they have AI where they're developing different traits for different plants. And so they can grow in different environments. They can grow with, I mean, they're not technically GMOs, but we're figuring out better ways to develop them and grow them so they can grow without a certain number of resources, so they can grow quicker, faster, have more like, like larger fruits, larger vegetables and stuff like that. And yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of where that happens. I mean, maybe we can develop some sort of AI where, it takes into account every single farm, every single processing facility, and it maps out like the perfect route, the perfect shipping route where there's like so much less waste or something like that. I don't know. Like it's going to be wild.
That is interesting. And I think it's just a limitation of the current models. I think ChatGPT 3.5 has information that it's been fed up until 2021. I think that's the data set or something like that. But it's just a matter of time. And I've seen images of like what the Chat 4 model is going to look like. And it's exponentially like more data. And so to your point, I think like figuring out things like that, like how do we address like the supply chain issues, or what's the shortest path to getting food to people, and how do we do that tracing so people feel more comfortable about where their food is grown? And I think there's a lot of challenges to be faced, but a lot of problems that can be solved. What has you excited about the farming industry in terms of like, how do you think about like who do you want to have conversations with? And obviously as a podcaster, it's always nice when you can have a conversation with someone and look forward to it because it's a topic that's near and dear to your heart.
Oh yeah, I love learning about people that have gone the direct to consumer route because they're completely shaking up the industry. I mean, for example, instead of a rancher just raising cattle and then sending it off to a feed yard and then it gets processed and then sold and then they get a little bit of money back, they are basically raising the cattle and then they've got to find a local processing unit and then process it there and then they can sell it, whether it's through a local business or they can sell it themselves. I mean, they're really shaking up the whole distribution model. I mean, the whole food supply chain, which I think is awesome because when they do that, not only does the consumer get what I think is a better product, a more local product, a fresher product, the farmer is also getting a little bit more money, which I think is huge. I mean, obviously, it doesn't matter if you're in CEA or whatever kind of farm you have, like you're not getting super duper rich off of it by any means. And so if you can profit just a little bit more by going the direct to consumer route, I think that's great. And then you can also build those relationships, which I think are phenomenal. And so I've interviewed several people. Boyd Farms is one that's here in North Florida and South Georgia. And there it's an old state senator, Alan Boyd. He's got a farm and they started doing the direct to consumer. And they've kind of exploded in terms of popularity. And so I love learning from them just kind of why they did it, how they did it, because it seems that even all the direct to consumer businesses do it completely different. I've interviewed another one called Rep Provisions, Honest Bison, Crowd Cow, a bunch of other ones that are doing it totally different and they're doing their own spin on it. Some offering Wagyu, some offering bison. And so I think that's always really cool. I think that's kind of the trend. I haven't really seen it in terms of like produce, fruits, vegetables, stuff like that, but I'm assuming something like that can happen. I mean, when you look at states like Florida, for example, we grow a lot of cucumbers, squash, strawberries, watermelon. Like maybe they can come together, have some sort of a co-op where they're sending out their produce. It's a subscription model or something like that, at least locally. So I think that'll be pretty cool.
Have you seen the conversation shift with, the topic maybe of climate change and just how variations in the weather? This was something that was really eye-opening for me when I went to Dubai. And, we're in the middle of a desert. There's trees and palm trees and, green plants throughout the city. But what's interesting is when you look at the base of the tree, there's like hoses running to everything. Everything needs to get irrigated. And then the next question is like, where's this water coming from? Like, is it desalination plants? And obviously there's a ton of money out in the Middle East, and specifically UAE. And so there's no shortage of creative ways to come up with how to get this stuff working. But what's really interesting is just because it's I think they get 90% of their food imported in that region. And so that's the extreme case. But, I'm seeing it here in Minneapolis, just like, where normally we get like below zero temperatures, and we had a bit of a cold spell, but like this week has been unseasonably warm. And so it's interesting as we think about all these different impacts to climate. I'm wondering, as farmers think about this, are they thinking more about CEA options, or are they exploring those as well?
Yeah, I've seen kind of both from the consumer and farmer perspective, like more focus on sustainability and regenerative ag. Like a lot of consumers are now asking, like 5 or 10 years ago, it was like, hey, is this organic or not? Now it's like, is this regeneratively raised or is this sustainable? I mean, a lot of farmers, again, kind of talking here in Florida, we've had a lot of hurricanes the past couple of years. And some people are like, is that because of climate change or is that because of Earth's natural processes? Like, what are some steps that we can do to help mitigate that and to help control that? And so, I mean, there's a lot of things like water control. We've got to check on how much water we're using. I know a lot of that in terms of, for example, when we talk about livestock and beef, a lot of people are saying like we need to switch to alternative proteins because beef is using a lot of water. And then a lot of experts say, well, like 90% of that water is because of rainwater runoff. So it's water that we wouldn't necessarily use. There is going to be a small percentage, like 10, 15%, but it just kind of varies. But I would say a lot of people are starting to recognize that more. And even, again, here in Florida, our Florida Farm Bureau has a program called This Farm Cares, and you get like recognition for doing all these environmental conscious practices like saving water, making sure the ecosystem to your farm is focused on the local ecosystem and making sure that you're not disturbing anything like wildlife, natural grasslands, and stuff like that. And so I think this whole trend of sustainability is kind of going everywhere. Like it's kind of impacting the environment. And people are saying that, CEA can help out traditional agriculture and traditional agriculture can help out CEA. Like if you're in an urban area, I think CEA is going to be perfect to help get you those locally grown produce to help with offsetting carbon emissions from transportation and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I think it's cool that more consumers and more farmers are slowly like paying more and more attention to sustainability and regenerative and like, hey, we're having an impact on the environment. Let's try to mitigate it. Let's try to fix it. Let's try to reduce the impact that we're having.
So as you think about this upcoming year and planning out the guests that you want to have on the show, the topics you want to cover, obviously, with a title like Farm Traveler, it's a broad range. So, from a podcasting perspective, it's helpful to kind of think about your audience and which content people are resonating with. So have you given some thought to what the plan looks like for the rest of this year and in terms of like, what would success look like for the show? And what are some conversations you want to start having with folks?
Yeah, I'm trying to plan out. I want to do about at least quarterly, like more farm tours and post them up on YouTube and do like short little reels and Facebook videos and stuff like that. Because I think that's super fun, like actually going there and like, being Farm Traveler. I didn't touch on this, but Farm Traveler, the name came from my favorite show on Travel Channel called Booze Traveler.
Okay.
And the host, Jack Maxwell, would travel around the world, travel around different states here in the US, and he would like highlight local spirits, like local liquors and the story behind them and stuff like that, which I thought was cool. And I was like, I kind of want to do that, but for farming, for agriculture. And so I want to do more like at least quarterly farm tours, put those up on the podcast as well, and then really interview kind of more people focused on agritourism and direct-to-consumer models and give people like, hey, if you want to go and tour here, here's what you can do. If you want to try their products, here's what their products are, and here's how you can order it, and you can get it in 2 or 3 days. Doesn't really matter where you are. And so I think that'll be huge. I'm trying to focus. Last year, I wanted to focus on numbers. I was like, I want to hit X amount of downloads, X amount of followers. But this year, I'm like, not worrying about that. I'm going to focus on the content and focus on like, trying to serve the audience a little bit more. And so I think just kind of focusing more on the direct-to-consumer model, agritourism, and also some cool innovations that are being made in ag, also kind of highlighting on that too.
Are there a couple that stand out for you?
Oh man, like innovations or just guests or
innovations, yeah.
I'm a geek when it comes to space stuff, and so I really want to talk about like satellite imaging. I can't remember the name of them. I follow them. Oh, Interstellar Labs. That's the name of them, I believe. I want to interview somebody from Interstellar Labs and learn about how we're going to grow food on Mars, on the moon, because when it comes to, shipping stuff to space is very, very expensive. And so if we're going to live on the moon, if we're going to live on Mars or the International Space Station for a while, we're going to have to grow our food and save a lot of that shipping weight. And so I think that'll be cool to kind of learn how hydroponics, how aeroponics are going to work in those environments. And so I want to interview somebody from there very, very soon. I think I have some contacts from Interstellar Labs. I'm going to try to like, hey, I want to chat with you guys, please. And so I think that'll be cool. I interviewed the daughter of the owner of White Oaks Pastures in Georgia, and they're huge. The guy that owns it, the dad, was on the Joe Rogan podcast a couple of weeks ago, and that one was huge. Like he's very into regenerative farming, sustainability, and all that stuff. And so I kind of want to have a repeat episode and maybe try to have him on the show and talk to him and eventually tour it, because I looked it up. I'm only like 4 hours away from him, which I was very surprised. Okay. So I like really want to go there and visit and tour him and actually see what's going on. So that's just, I don't know, kind of a scratching the surface about maybe what 2023 can offer.
I had a great conversation with Nadun Hinayaka. He's the CEO of Gaia Australia, and they're working with NASA to kind of test out some farming in space. So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I really want to learn more about how that's going to go down. And even, I'm sure there's companies out there, but I want to learn more about like how we're going to like raise fish, for example, because I think that's like the most efficient protein that we can grow that's like animal based. And so, like for 1 pound of feed you give a fish, it's going to put on 1 pound of body mass. And so obviously we can ship little fish. Like I think that's going to weigh a little bit less than like shipping a big old cow. But eventually we got to figure out how we can enjoy a steak on Mars. So we got to figure that out too.
There's that whole cellular agriculture movement as well, which is, it's so funny because as a podcaster, I'm like, wow, you could literally start a show. And I think I even grabbed the domain. It might have expired by now, but Cellular Agriculture Podcast, because I was just like, this is fascinating. Like every protein you can imagine has been grown now in a lab, like shrimp, obviously fish, meat, so it's almost that interesting base. There's the actual protein from the animal. There's the plant-based protein, which has kicked off its own wave of stuff too, right? And then there's the cellular. So it's like the taste. And some of these, I read the Future Food or Food Hack newsletter, which is fascinating to see all the funding going in from all these companies about like unami grade sushi that's grown in a lab, and it's got the same taste, same marbling, same everything without the, impact of overfishing. So we're living through some interesting times, I'll tell you that much. And so there's so much happening. And so it seems like we're both well poised to see, what the future is going to look like in the world of farming. So it's really exciting times.
Oh yeah, it's definitely going to change. I mean, it'll be cool to kind of see where it goes. And I interviewed a guy, he's got a show called Future Food Podcast, I think, and they talk about cellular agriculture.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's wild. It's tuna, it's fish, but it's not, but it is. Like, I heard somebody say this like 10, 15 years ago, and they were like really on point. They're like, imagine in your kitchen, you've got your stove, your microwave, you've got your fridge, and now we've got Instapot, air fryers, everything. Well, imagine if you have a 3D printer in there that if you want a steak, you can print it, and it's going to be a legitimate steak. It's going to be a legitimate burger. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's going to taste just like the real thing. I think it's crazy to say, but I think we're not too super far off from that. I mean, it's going to be wild.
And then you connect it to your Chat GPT instance, and you basically you give it a text instruction to be like, hey, can you please prepare dinner tonight? And I'd like some steak, cellular grown steak, medium well, with some farm, with some organic rice and some and it's going to basically figure out what to do, where to go, what to order, what to prepare with your 3D. It's the Jetsons, but most of the Jetson stuff I think has already happened. So
yeah, I think that's a good comparison. It's the Jetsons. I mean, we can essentially maybe in the future print like a full 5-star Michelin dinner in our kitchen without leaving it. I mean, I think that'll be wild. It'll be cool. It'll be wild.
That seems like a good pausing point to let the listener digest. And, obviously we can always pick this up in a future discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time to reach out and connect as a fellow podcaster. Always interested to see what others are doing in this space. I'm grateful that we were able to share your story and learn how you got into the space, which I always think is fascinating and inspiring. So I really thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Harry. Always a pleasure chatting with another podcaster. And I love listening to your show, learning about, all that's going on in vertical farming. I think you're doing a great job. I mean, obviously you've got like the best podcast in the industry. So
thank you.
Yeah, great chatting with you.
So when folks, obviously Farm Traveler on anywhere you listen to podcasts, and make sure you do that. Anywhere else you want to send folks to connect with you in the show?
Yeah, if they want to check out our website, it's just thefarmtraveler.com. And of course, if you go on social media, I'm super active on Instagram and Facebook, nothing else really, but just look up Farm Traveler and you'll find us there via our website, thefarmtraveler.com. It's got links for all that stuff.
And like any good podcast host, I'll make sure that for the listener, all those links will be available in the show notes as well.
Hey, perfect. Yeah, you got to make it as easy as possible for the listener.
Yeah. Thanks again for your time, Trevor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Trevor for coming on the show and sharing his podcasting journey and also the overlap that we have between our shows and how honored we've been to have these conversations on this topic. By all means, make sure you subscribe and follow his show, Farm Traveler. Full show notes available for this episode and all past episodes at verticalfarmingpodcast.com. They include summaries, timestamps, key takeaways, and any resources mentioned in the show. Make sure you check those out. Special thanks to our Season 7 title sponsor, Cultivated. If you're looking into a vertical farm and don't know where to start or which technology would suit your needs, reach out to them today. Best of all, their service is free because they work on behalf of their partners. Learn more at cultivated.com, and that's spelled cultivatd.com. Just leave out that last E. This episode is brought to you by Indoor AgCon 2023. I'm so happy to have been working with the team last year. Indoor AgCon 2022 was my very first indoor farming conference. So it was really eye-opening for me. So I'll always be grateful to the team there for rolling out that carpet for me. And really had a good time meeting a lot of past guests and excited to join them again this year. Entering its 10th year in a row, it's the largest trade show and conference for vertical farming and CEA, and it's returning to Caesars Forum Conference Center in Las Vegas on February 27th and 28th of 2023. Once again, they'll be co-located with the National Growers Association show as well, which is a really good fit for them. The conference keeps growing, and this year it's doubled in size. The expo floor now has more than 170 booths filled with new product resources and solutions to explore. You'll hear from experts, including CEOs, growers, investors, and others in the field during this full-scale educational conference. As always, you'll be able to connect with peers, grocers, and other potential new business partners at their great networking events. I haven't even gotten to the best part. The team at Indoor AgCon has given listeners of this show 20% off their full access conference pass. All you have to do is use promo code VFP, as in Vertical Farming Podcast, and sign up at indoor.ag. See you there. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Learn more about how a podcast can be beneficial for your brand at fullcast.co. And as a reminder, if you're enjoying this show or past shows, leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/VFP. I'd be more than happy to read those out on future episodes. Tune in next week for my conversation with another fascinating leader from the world of CEA. It's Emiliano Gutierrez from Raiz Farms. Until we meet again, here's to your health.
Thanks for listening. To read the full show notes for this episode, which includes any links mentioned in the episode, as well as a full show transcription, visit verticalfarmingpodcast.com. There, you can sign up for our email list to be notified when new episodes are published.